What's going on, guys? It's Bromley at Empire Barbell, and today we're going to go down our bench press checklist. Make sure that you're checking all the right boxes when it comes to getting your pressing capacity in your upper body taken care of. Before we get started, if you wouldn't mind clicking the subscribe button and the notification bell. We're putting out 3 to 4 videos a week. You want to make sure you don't get left behind, get them as they come out. Thanks for your support. It's been amazing for our channel. So the channel's been around long enough where we've covered the big stuff over and over, and we're going to keep covering it, but we're going to work now as we move forward into taking those principles and making sure that we know how to apply them to different scenarios. This is how we keep the saw sharp. We revisit old principles on a regular basis to make sure they're always at the front of our mind. And that's going to sharpen our ability to apply them and make sure that that is what's taking priority. But it's also going to prevent us from looking at a lot of the fluff and getting lost by focusing on things that people tend to hyper focus on, but they're really distractions, really keeps you from doing the important. So it always helps when you're starting a program or you're in the middle of a program to make these little checklists down, whether it's for your diet, whether it's for a lift, whether it's for your life goals, just to make sure that you're staying on the right track and you're remembering the important stuff. So today we're going to take this approach with the bench press, and this is basically where we just boil down a handful of vitally important things. It makes organization easier, it makes conceptualization easier, and that means that your adherence to doing the right things is going to be a lot higher. You're going to have a much higher success rate. It's going to make more sense to you. So we broke this down into basically the movements, the lifts that we're going to focus on. Basically those are the tools that we're going to use to chisel out a big bench press. These are the techniques we're going to use, how we're going to arrange those exercises in a week, and then how we're going to evolve that over a period of weeks. So this covers what we're doing in the workout, and then this covers how we're moving that forward to make sure that progress is continued. So starting off, whenever you're focusing on a lift, you want to get your exercises down. There's a lot of different flavors of training, and they're all valid. They all have kind of a different lean, different flavor. There's pros and cons. Don't get lost in the idea of thinking one is inherently better than the other. It's all relative to you as an individual, what your capacity to handle work over time is like. And it all changes really dramatically based on what you've done before. So a lot of times people try something and it works great and they think it's the best thing they can do. And oftentimes it just happens to be just different enough from what you were doing that it created that new surge of growth. Because remember, variety is important to prevent stagnation. And sometimes there's a very specific type of variation that just pushes you up to the next level. And that's ultimately what we're looking for getting a handle on when it comes to periodization over time. So the first thing we're going to start off with, the main movements, is a bench press, obviously. Now, what separates a bench press from a lot of other lifts is how technique is important. Technique is always important. You always want to try to be as efficient and controlled as possible. But benching doesn't tend to feature the same degree of technical proficiency, or doesn't require it to the degree that some of the other lifts might, where you might see some of the better, let's say, sumo deadlifters. You might see some of the better in the Olympics. If you want to compete in the Olympics and Olympic lifting, you have to be extraordinarily technical, and the training is dialed in around that. With the bench press, it is more of a one-dimensional movement. Even if you have the technique down, the little fine-tuned stuff like twerking into the bar, getting the elbows tucked, arching, getting your lats engaged, even if you have a sense of that, it doesn't tend to be something that requires the same degree of dialing in at all times. That's evident by a lot of the best benchers of all time who were just bigger guys, didn't necessarily specialize benching all the time, had variations, or did a lot of very non-specific, not necessarily technical work as their backbone. Leroy Walker came close to a 700-pound bench, and he cites the incline bench as the driving force of his bench. In fact, he'll incline bench all the way up to a meet. You have someone like Eric Spada, who's just a gym rat. He just liked to train. He just got very big, and he developed a ton of raw pressing power. Even someone like Julius Maddox, you see he takes a bar down really quickly and gives it kind of a heave up. It doesn't appear to be as controlled and as technical. The cues he uses work for him, and he's good with them, but it doesn't require the same degree of technique. One of my favorite Dan Green quotes, when he wrote West of West Side, he talked about realizing the importance of technique, but also the limitations, that he wasn't going to arch his way to a 600-pound bench, that at some point he just had to build up his upper body, fix weaknesses, and get his nervous system operating a little bit better. So that's where this differentiates a little bit. It's technique is still important, but I consider benching just a little bit more one-dimensional, and that gives us more variation. That means that more broader changes, as long as it shows themselves in a little more mass on your upper body and better efficiency, that you're going to get better. So that gives us some leeway with how we structure our benching. Where something like squatting, or if you've had trouble with your deadlift or the Olympic lifts, require a lot of precision and executing the same movement the same exact way over and over and over, we can emphasize variations a little bit more. We can take more time away from benching. And as long as we've seen some positive growth with those movements or in that specific threshold, we tend to see improvement when we go back to benching. So that's an important thing to know. So while we do want to prioritize the bench press and make sure that we get a lot of benching in, or at least enough to get the growth that we're looking for, we know that we can emphasize variations. Now, variations are key in any lift for two reasons. One, it's an opportunity to fix weaknesses. So even if we just go on a simple bench press progression and we just manipulate volume and intensity over time to get the bench press to go up, we have a sense that we can always do a little bit better if we are also focusing on bringing up limitations. If your triceps are weak, or if you're very slow off your chest, or if you have a big dead spot in the middle where the bar inexplicably slows before slamming to lockout. There's weaknesses we can sometimes identify either in technique and patterning, or if a muscle is lagging behind some of the others. We always have this sense that if we target them, we can increase faster than if we just manipulate volume and intensity to create growth in the bench press. So the variations are good for fixing those weaknesses. If there's a weakness we can identify and we know which appropriate variation to pick. The variations also provide variation for the sake of it, which keeps you well-rounded. It keeps you from getting stale. So by having different movements to go back and forth, we can get comfortable in more disadvantaged positions, and that will create another kind of cushion that will make us a little more resilient in the bench press, maybe widen the margin of error. A certain amount of variety in your training is good, just as much as movement specificity is good. Now I put here pick two because you also don't want to go crazy with the variations. I'm not a fan of training protocols that involve doing a lot of different movement. I think people in general, trainees in general, tend to suffer more from training ADD than they do tend to suffer from being too consistent in their training. We tend to see people want to jump around, and that causes them to lose the thread of growth and progress, whereas most trainees would be infinitely better off if they could figure out how to take a few movements, train them for a set period of time, and realize growth in that period of time. Because then long-term growth is just taking those pockets of training and stacking them on top of each other. But that's where a lot of people fall short. And if you have training ADD, that's going to be part of it. So I like to include the bench press and then no more than 2 variations done at some point throughout the week. And then your goal with those variations is to get good at them. You want to see those move up. And then if those move up, you should see carryover to your benching. Now, I also don't like to get crazy with the variations. I don't like very exotic movements. You can use specialty bars. I think it overcomplicates things. I like to just stick to a few basic changes, changing the grip from close to wide, putting a tempo, say controlling the descent, pausing at different points along the lift, spotto pressing, just simply stopping a little short of your chest. For most of you, that is a huge change in stimulus, and you'll notice almost instantly how much harder it is. And as you get better at that, you'll notice you have more control off your chest. Pin and board presses. I'm a big fan of pin presses. I don't like to go really crazy with overload work. I like to keep it within a few inches of the chest. I maintain most people need to emphasize strengthening the bar speed and control off their chest than they do need lockout work. And I like incline pressing. You can, of course, overcomplicate this if you want to, but I think that's ill-advised. There's no bonus points for rigging any of these up with accommodating resistance, some mix of bands, chain, slingshot, on a tsunami bar, on an exactly 22.5 degree incline. Just pick a couple standard variations, train it long enough to where you notice you get good at it, and then in the next phase of training, swap them out for a couple more. Take notes, see what you respond to, move back and forth in a periodic fashion, and you're going to be able to maintain growth over a very long period of time. Accessory and isolation. Now this is where the bench press is pretty substantially different than the other static lifts, specifically lower body lifts. This actually goes overhead pressing too. You need a big, or at least very well-rounded, fleshed out upper body. That's just mandatory. Benching requires a big base. It requires your shoulders to stay put. It requires stability at the bottom. We notice that when your arms get a little bigger, when your shoulders and upper back get a little bigger, you get more compression at the bottom. That helps you build more power at the start of the bench. It also helps keep your joints safe, and they don't take quite as much of a beating when you have more padding filling out your joints. Bigger biceps, it's basically like wearing elbow wraps, right? Bigger lats, it's basically, if there was an equivalent of a shoulder wrap that would create compression at the bottom. So that by itself helps with strength just for the sake of it by increasing compression, but really it is keeping your joints healthy, keeping them stable, keeping you more efficient. Because remember, if you can't keep from getting injured, you're not going to last long enough to get stronger in the first place. So joint health and longevity is just as important as anything else we're going to cover. So you want to make sure that your back and shoulders are getting just as much love as everything else. Back, you don't need to get fancy. I love bent rows, dumbbell rows, T-bar rows, lat pull downs, specifically things that get in the traps and upper back. We'll talk about the rear delts a lot. So all of those rowing variations are going to help bring that up to some capacity. Shoulder work, I do a ton of shoulder pressing because I'm a strongman. You don't necessarily have to. I think overhead pressing is a fantastic developer, just like dips are a fantastic developer. But if you are doing a lot of bench volume throughout the week, you can get by with doing things like raises, upright rows, any type of machine work that's going to hit your delts. As long as your delts are getting hit aggressively, and you can recover from the stimulus while progressing it forward week to week, that's all that you need. So depending on what your bench volume and frequency looks like, you might find that you can fit overhead presses in pretty easily, or dips, or you might find that that's a little too hard on the joints, so you're going to prioritize benching and get by with some type of shoulder work. But the shoulders need to be strong. Pretty much every person watching this, if they can find a way to grow their shoulders just a little bit, they're going to immediately notice a bigger bench press. Pecs are part of that. Now, there have been some controversy in the past. I don't know if anybody still repeats this, that pecs aren't important. That's stupid. Pecs are extremely important. Pecs literally is what bring your upper arm up. The bigger they are, the bigger bench is going to be. This is evident by pretty much every raw bench world record holder in the world. Flies, believe it or not, if you get better at flies, you're going to feel better at benching. I like doing them slow and controlled. Make sure you're not straining your bicep tendon. Machine presses, cable flies, pullovers, anything that hits your pecs is going to help your bench press. There's just no two ways about it. And I noticed the bigger my pecs are, better my shoulders feel. Actually, it's like benching on a cloud. Biceps are hugely important. It's thought of as eye candy, but to be honest, bigger biceps stabilize your elbow joint. It makes your tricep extend more efficiently, and it creates compression at the bottom, putting that padding around your elbow, so it checks a lot of boxes. Obviously, everybody knows triceps at this point. That's the bench press talking point. Oh, your bench is low? Do more tricep work, bro. The only trick with triceps is finding out appropriate exercises and an amount of tricep work that doesn't destroy your elbows. Because if you're doing any amount of bench and bench variation volume, you're going to find that doing a bunch of heavy skull crushers might not go well, especially if you're benching multiple times per week. So if you are doing a lot of bench volume and a lot of pressing variations, you don't need a ton of work. Find some movement that is easy on your elbows that you can progress over time. For me, for a long time, it was band press downs. Anything else killed my elbows. So I progressed my band press downs. My triceps grew. It didn't matter that I was doing sets of 50 to 100. I just found a way to add resistance and found a way to do more density, and they grew. Eventually, I progressed to things like kickbacks, then heavier cable press downs. Eventually, I got to the point where I could do dumbbell skull crushers. Those are some of my favorites now. And then I'll do different variations of French presses, and occasionally I will throw in skull crushers, but they're still a little hard on my elbow, so I can't go that aggressively. JM presses are a good one. Experiment. It doesn't matter what you do. You don't need to do every one under the sun. Pick one or two and then make that your bread and butter, and you can train it multiple times a week if you want. So we got an idea of the main movements. We need your entire upper body developed. That means giving just as much attention to these auxiliary movements, these accessory movements, as we are giving to variations in the main movement. So now we need to know how to arrange them. Well, you have options. The spectrum ranges from very high frequency, where you're benching or doing some bench variation multiple times per week, to a typical bro split, where maybe you just bench once a week. The truth is, for as much as people have discussed the pros and cons of one or the other, the truth is they're all valid. They've all worked. There have been stellar benchers throughout history that have utilized this split and utilized that split. One isn't necessarily better than the other. I've experimented with both. I think a good trick to look at is to consider what your total weekly volume looks like. Count up all the bench sets you're doing, all of the upper back, all the shoulder, all the tricep sets you're doing, and find an amount of work that is a stable baseline for you, and just focus on progressing that. If it's all spread throughout the week and you're doing it 3 to 4 times a week, that just means you're going to be a little more fresh because you're not doing so much work in one workout. So you're going to be able to handle a little bit more intensity throughout the entire week. If you're doing it all in one day, you're going to find you fatigue because of all the work you're cramming into one session. So even though the load might not be as high, fatigue is going to be really high. That's also a good marker for growth. They both have pros and cons, and you're going to find that if you've done it one way for a while, switching to another way is going to give another surge in growth. Just keep in mind that going heavy multiple times a week is ill-advised. And I have a video I'll put up. I have a video about training multiple times per week and how you arrange that. But this can look like DUP, where you're doing a day of 8s, a day of 5s, and a day of 3s. Or it could be a heavy, medium, light split where you're working the same threshold and you're just arbitrarily changing the volume and intensity so you can recover. Like the way Andy Baker does heavy, medium, light. There might be a day where you hit a top 5. There might be a day where you hit kind of a harder 3 or 4 sets of 5. And then there might be a day where you do 2 sets of 5 at a reduced percentage, which is a recovery day. So that's another option. You can also change the variations. You can work in the same threshold or different thresholds and do a bench with a different variation on each day. There's a lot of ways to do it. The point is it doesn't matter, okay? As long as you set a baseline of work that is not overkill and you progress it evenly. So on this high frequency split, you're gonna be doing all of your auxiliary work each day. And I like to keep it simple because it makes it idiot proof. I'll do the exact same exercises. There's no reason you can't do front raises after each one. There's no reason you can't do bent rows after each one. There's no reason you can't do the same bicep exercise after each one. Can you change it? Absolutely. But just make sure you're not getting manic and trying to fit everything in, and that the variation is actually kind of warranted, that it fits some purpose. The bro split, if you're doing all your benching on one day, you're gonna go heavier on whatever your main lift is, and then you're gonna follow it up with a couple variations. And then you're going to limit your accessory to whatever goes with kind of a bench or a chest day or whatever you like. And you're probably going to schedule your back work and your shoulder work on different days. You could hit all your bench variations and then do just tricep work afterwards. Then maybe the next day you do back and do your bicep work. Then maybe the next day you do shoulders. Maybe do more tricep work. Maybe do more trap or delt work. There's a lot of ways to do it. Point is, here's a little tip for those of you that are looking at switching to some different bench program. If you're used to a bro split, I want you to try the high frequency. If you're used to high frequency, I want you to try the bro split. Whatever you do, make it work for you. That'll give you a ton of insight when it comes to evaluating programs in the future. Then we go into the threshold we're working in the progression. So the threshold is going to be just the percentage. So standard linear periodization, you're going to start at a 60 to 70% range. You're going to do that for so many weeks, then move up into the 80 to 90% range, and then move into the 90 plus. You might do that over 8 weeks. You might do it over 16. Again, it really doesn't matter. I like to keep it simple. I like to focus on a threshold for each lift, and it might be 8s and 10s and 12s. It might be 5s and 6s. It depends on what I was doing before. If you've been working in a specific threshold recently, I want you to look to what the next logical progression might be. If you've been doing high reps, look to low reps. If you've been doing low reps, look to medium reps. The point is we need to get good at one specific threshold, train long enough to see that progress, and then at some period of time we're going to transition. So pick it. If you're up in the air, do 10s and 12s. Nobody does 10s and 12s. They work fantastically well. It's a staple. I promise you you'll grow. So look at the 10s and 12s. 10s and 12s are fantastic for things like wide and close grip. They're fantastic for incline. As you get into things like pin presses, spotto presses, tempo presses, like tempos, you're under tension longer. Pin presses are typically associated with heavier loads, so you might be looking at 6 reps or under for those. So you always want to do your heaviest work first, do your lighter work later in the workout when you're fatigued, and then you just need to find a way to increase it. There's a ton of progressions. Again, how you progress, it doesn't matter. I'm a big fan when I'm starting out a bench cycle of volumizing. I want to adapt to greater amounts of volume. That's going to correlate to more muscle growth. That's going to equate to a bigger base for when I start loading up later. That's a tenet of linear periodization. Start high volume with a big varied array of exercises. Get more specific and heavier as time goes on. It doesn't have to be a crisp straight line, but it does help if there's some tangible period of volume followed by some tangible period of intensification. So I think of them as kind of these nebulous areas that I move back and forth between. So volumizing, going 3 sets of 10 one week, then 4 sets, then 5 sets. Even if I keep the weight the same, I'll add weight if I can, but even if I keep the weight the same, that's a huge increase in volume. Then I'll reset and I'll go sets of 8, a little bit heavier, 3 sets, 4 sets, 5 sets. That works fantastically well. That's one of my favorite methods. You can also step load, which is just keeping the weight the same. You know, week 1, you're doing sets of 4, then you add a rep each time, and then you reset with a little more weight. Step loading works very well as a way of increasing volume. Increasing load is everybody's favorite method, but understand that's not the only one. There's a lot of ways to increase load. Just make the sets and reps static, add 5 pounds each time. Even though that's a novice recommendation, linear progressions work well for advanced lifters. We just can't do it as long. So if I'm not used to a certain threshold or lift, or if I'm not used to, let's say, a rep set to failure, I'll do something like the Grayscale LP, where the last set is to failure, and you just add 5 pounds each time. And I'm so new to that stimulus that what happens is I end up hitting PRs every session. Now, I'm not going to keep that up for 6 months like somebody who's new might do it, but I know I'm going to have a deadline of about 3 or 4 weeks, and I'm going to have realized some tangible growth, and it's time to move on to some other motor progression. So these methods still work. You just have to know how to modify them based on how advanced you are. Now, periodization, that's just adding weight as you adjust the reps down to accommodate. So you could have a specific threshold, start it. If you're a 400-pound bencher, start at 250 and have planned jumps in weight, and just modify the sets and reps down as you get heavier to accommodate. These are all valid. There's a million variations and everything in between. Again, it doesn't matter. Do it long enough to get good at it, then do something else. Now, long enough to get good at it, that means minimum 3 weeks. For most of you, you could carry this out for 6 or 8 weeks before you really have to change something up. So keep that in mind. You don't have to deload every 4th week, okay? You can let your body kind of dictate. And that actually brings us to our last point, which is the deadline. The deadline is having an idea of when whatever you're doing is going to stop and you're going to do something else. So notice our arrangement kind of goes from what we're doing in the week versus, here we're doing what we're doing in the day, then what we're doing in the week, what our split is like, and then that's what we're doing week to week, how we're progressing, and then we go down to how we're taking those chunks of weeks and then progressing them forward by making variations, doing something else. So this is kind of a rough outline of periodization. And no matter how you arrange it, as long as there's planned variation, that counts as periodization. So the deadline is going to be maybe a set period of time. Maybe you sit down, write it out, and you say, I'm going to do this for 3 weeks. Then I'm going to make this calculated change in threshold or exercises or frequency. Then maybe it's a longer plan. Maybe you have a fully fleshed out 16-week plan. That's fine too. Maybe it's going to be a linear progression that you run for 16 weeks because you're new and you think you can get away with it. Maybe you're going to let your body tell you. Maybe it's going to be till you just can't meet the requirements anymore. Some people take linear progressions till the wheels fall off and then they reset or they move into another logical program. If you're doing any one of these, you might just put a question mark. I'm going to do this until I feel like I'm not getting anything out of it. And then I'll take a deload and then I'll change the threshold and start over. There's a ton of options here. I think following programs is very valuable, but I think for most of you that train recreationally, it is required at some point that you have winged it enough to get an actual sense of how your body responds to which changes. That still means you should take notes. That doesn't mean you're just justifying doing whatever the hell you want, but have some perimeters, have some boundaries that are principally based, and let yourself move week to week and experience how your body changes. Make some decisions on the fly, just as long as they're not just impulsively what you want to do that day and they're actually tied into some plan or. So I know this is a lot to cover. A lot of this is applicable to other lifts, but specifically these are the exercises and considerations we have to make for the bench press. As long as you set a baseline of work, as long as it's sustainable, and as long as you are progressing the stimulus in a predictable pattern, you will grow your bench press. Keep that in mind, okay? Don't get frustrated. Don't say I'm just doomed to have a poverty bench. You're not. So let me know what you guys think, if this was helpful or not. Go ahead and leave your comments in the comment box, or go ahead and take it to the forum, empire-forum.com. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley at Empire Barbell. I'll see you.